Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. We are in the home stretch, 2 weeks to go. Monday was a very interesting day because we had one of the strongest contrasts of the campaign. On one hand, you had Kamala Harris and Liz Cheney sitting down in three separate conversational settings in three swing states, talking for 40 minutes or so about national security, about the rule of law, about the requirements of the presidency, about abortion, about finding common ground, about the qualities we need in a president. They plainly did not agree on every issue, but in the way they interacted with one another, you could imagine a better kind of politics, one where decent people enter public office and actually try to work on problems, try to see issues from the other point of view, try to figure out, even on issues like abortion, where there is a wide gap, if there's some common ground. When Liz Cheney acknowledged that the abortion bans in the wake of Dobbs were making it difficult, if not impossible, for women to get care, that was an intelligent conversation by a sincere person who was willing to confront reality. And Kamala Harris, to her credit, did not say, well, what did you expect? We told you so. She said, well, I don't know that all Republicans thought that this would be the case, but at least we now recognize there's a problem. That's how adults problem solve. That's how you deal with neighbors and friends and grown-ups in your own life. And it was so refreshing because it was so civil, it was so decent, and the questions from the audience were intelligent. You found like you were back on planet Earth, on something that approximated democracy, that made you somewhat proud to be an American in a system in which politics can aspire to something better than what we've had. And then on the other side, we got replays of Donald Trump at McDonald's, Donald Trump talking about Arnold Palmer's junk. We had Donald Trump insulting and lying still about the hurricane. We had vile language from Donald Trump. He operates in the gutter. He is a lowlife that seeks to drag everyone and everything down with him because he thinks if everyone is down in the mud with him, then he stands a chance. If we're going to play on a playing field in which honor, decency, intelligence is the measure, he's going to lose, and he knows that. So he tries to disgrace our politics. He tries to pollute our language, and it is pathetic. We do see some improvement in the way the media is covering him. At least there are now some front page stories and top of the news stories on cable TV news about his emotional, mental, physical deterioration. Finally. Now, where were they for months and months? As listeners of this program know, we've been talking about it for over a year. It's evident that he's not all there. It's evident that he can't sustain a thought. It's evident he can't finish a sentence. It's evident that he lives in a world of delusions. But the media couldn't bring themselves to really acknowledge that until it became so acute. And you know what? Until Kamala Harris started making a big deal of it, until she raised it at her own rallies, until she started showing clips of him. The press was somehow afraid, embarrassed, not willing to cover what is arguably the biggest story in American political history, and that is someone who is mentally unwell could very well be elected president of the United States. That's a pretty big story. That's the biggest story we've ever had. And they've been unwilling to face it because to do that would mean that they had to throw away their phony balance, their pretend neutrality, and they would actually have to acknowledge one party is incessantly lying, is catering to our worst instincts, and the other is not. And for them, that's just not what they think they're there for. They're not in the truth telling business. They're there in the feigned insider business. They're there to assert their authority and their knowledge of how politics really works. And that's what's wrong with our media. That's what's wrong with our politics. They're no longer in the truth seeking business, as ugly and as dismaying as that may be. They're in the keep people engaged and anxious and following the politics game, because that's how we get the clicks and that's how we get paid. That is no different, by the way, than what social media does. They're playing the same game: engage, infuriate, produce anxiety, and you'll hang around longer and they'll get more ad dollars and they'll sell more minutes on TV. That's sad. That's not a media environment conducive to producing educated voters. So we have to hope and pray and work to make sure that Americans get what's going on here, that they see Donald Trump for who he is, and they decide that they are better than that, that there is something worth preserving in America. If they consider themselves patriots, if they consider themselves decent Americans, that they don't have to accept this grotesque figure. And the fact that it is such a struggle is distressing, but it should not be disabling. We have an election, and we can beat this. We can beat him. We can defeat this notion of politics that it's all a game, that it's all about leveling the playing field so you can get back at the people you hate. It's all about settling scores. It's not. It's about making life better. It's about improving the lives of ordinary people. And it's about leading the world as the democratic powerhouse that we are. You know, two figures came out this week that should impress upon you how important and how impressive America still is. For the second year in the row, the IMF recognized that the United States is the leading economic power. We have grown at about 3%, which is better than the rest of the developed world. It also came out that thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, seniors have saved about $1 billion in prescription drug costs. Those are real achievements that mean a better life for people, mean they can attain wealth, they can attain security, they can send their kids to decent schools, they can have a decent life. That's what we should be aiming at, not turning politics into a nasty game of gotcha and put downs and who can be more vile than the next guy. So let's get to work. This is not a done deal. I believe Kamala Harris is narrowly ahead, but she's going to depend upon enthusiasm and turnout, and she's going to depend upon some decent Republicans like Liz Cheney, who are still out there, who can be convinced that some things are more important than a tax cut. And I really do think we have an electoral majority for that. With global warming and rising energy bills, finding the right temperature at night is a struggle we all face. It can make it so hard to fall asleep, but recently I found a way to sleep in perfect comfort all night long. Whether you sleep too hot or even too cold, my secret is using thermoregulating, NASA-inspired, silver-infused bed sheets by Miracle Made. Their self-cleaning, antibacterial bedding even prevents 99.7% of bacteria, so they stay fresher 3 times longer. That means 3 times less laundry, too. Thanks to Miracle Made, you'll stop sleeping on bacteria that can clog your pores and lead to breakouts and acne. They even eliminate bad odors, so your bed always feels freshly made. Life is much more comfortable and clean with Miracle. Their temperature regulating, silver infused fabrics were inspired by NASA to give you maximum comfort no matter what the weather is like outside. Just picture yourself getting a better night's sleep every night. Plus, Miracle sheets feel soft and luxurious without the high price tag of other luxury brands. And they're beautiful. They come in a whole array of colors. My favorite is the navy blue. And they feel even nicer than bed sheets used by some five-star hotels. So you'll feel like you're on vacation every time you get into bed. I imagine I'm in the south of France, or maybe in London, or maybe the South Pacific. Well, wherever you want to go, Miracle will help you get to dreamland. Miracle has a whole line of comfortable, self cleaning bedding, pillowcases, and comforters. I know you'll love them. How do you get them? Go to trymiracle.com/greenroom to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo, Green Room, at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product that it's backed with a 30-day money back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a free refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. So go to trymiracle.com/greenroom and use the code GREENROOM to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/greenroom to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle, for sponsoring this episode. You can look for the link in the show notes. This week, we've seen Donald Trump in a variety of settings. We saw him pretend to work at McDonald's. We have seen him dancing. We've seen him at his most crass and crude. And it reminds me that Donald Trump, to put it mildly, has never been an authentic person. He is always play acting, he's always inhabiting a role. And when I got to thinking about it, it reminded me that his whole life, his whole career, his whole pseudo success as a mogul is invented. And we are fortunate that there is a book, a best selling book, beautifully, magnificently researched by 2 New York Times reporters, Russ Buettner and Susanne Craig, that looks at his quote success and how much was real, how much wasn't, how much the magic of Hollywood created something that wasn't there. They have spent years researching this book. The title is Lucky Loser: How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. So, what a perfect time to have them both with us. Welcome, Russ and Susanne.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It is an absolute pleasure. The book that you have researched, which goes into such magnificent detail, it's really a tribute to both of you as reporters, as researchers, as investigators, looks at or tries to peel back the layers of Donald Trump's finances. Let's start before The Apprentice. The questions that I always get from readers is, first of all, how much did he really inherit? And secondly, what was left, or what was his financial state before Mark Burnett and Apprentice came along?
Those are excellent questions. We spent a lot of years trying to figure that out. You'll remember back in 2016, he said, I just got a small $1 million loan from my father. I had to repay it with interest, and then I built it into this fortune. So we started this long endeavor to try to figure that out. We can go into how that happened. But what we came up with ultimately, after we obtained all of his father's financial records for many years, was that he had gotten from his dad at least $413 million over the course of his life. And that was in 2018 dollars. It would be more by now. And he had lost a high percentage of that trying to start businesses that made him look like an effective business person. And then when Mark Burnett comes along in about 2003, he's really not fully recovered from his early 1990s meltdown when his casinos went bankrupt, the Plaza Hotel went bankrupt, his lenders took away the airline he had bought, and a lot of the yacht he had bought, a lot of his bigger toys and properties. And he was doing kind of small ball stuff, trying to get into golf, having mixed results with that. It's not a high profit business, even on its own. And then his casinos, once again, were about to go bankrupt, and he would have to come up with $50 million to hang on to any sort of ownership stake in those in order to get through that. And so he really kind of needed money. But Mark Burnett thought he was dealing with this really rich, busy guy who he would have to really like give a lot of money to in order to encourage him to go with it. So he made this incredible deal that made Donald rich all over again, brought him the equivalent through money from the show, from a very generous deal that Mark Burnett gave him, half of the sponsorship money, and then through a bunch of licensing deals that came Donald's way because of his newfound fame, another $400 million over the course of the life of that show. And then there's another lucky stroke that he got where he got forced into a business. Altogether, that's like $1.5 billion for not doing anything that had anything to do with business expertise at all, just for being born and being a television star.
So, Suzanne, let's go back to that failed period of time where he did have his bankruptcies and his hotel. People have joked, how do you go bankrupt running a casino? How was it that he lost all this money? Was he bad at it? Did he have a stroke of bad luck and open casinos at the wrong time? How did he fritter away all this money?
Well, he was particularly bad at it, and I think that the nub of it is he opened ultimately, he was running 3 casinos that were competing against each other, and he just couldn't win. This was in Atlantic City, and he initially went in with a partner, and that didn't go well, and then he opened 2 more casinos, and it didn't go well for him, as we know. But that's the nub of what happened there.
And when he went into bankruptcy, the banks really put him on an allowance at one point. They restricted what he could pay. He was really kind of hampered in what he could do. Do you have any insight into psychologically where he was at that point? Was he feeling like a failure? Was he in denial? When he's put on an allowance and he's in bankruptcy, you would think that this would be like, if not a come to Jesus, at least a come to reality kind of moment. But I sense it was not.
I think you're exactly right. I think his capacity to create a safe space for himself in which he lives, and to believe that it's all going to be great or all is great, and to frame it in that way is unsurpassed. And that was a great, probably the situation where he exercised that tendency the most. He framed that. I think it was a $450,000 a month allowance.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a lot. It is a lot of money, right? But it was not quite enough to even cover what he was spending to keep Mar-a-Lago open at the time, let alone the West Side yards that he was trying to develop and had not been able to do anything and was paying $10 to $20 million a year to hang on to. But he framed it as, this is just me coming out of this great situation. I'm still going to live this incredible life I've always lived. Robin Leach was quoted in wire stories that ran across the country saying Trump is being held like back a little bit, but look at how great it is, $400,000 a month. So he just packaged it as part of a comeback story. And in fact, very soon threw a party for himself at the Taj Mahal, I believe, which was dragging his entire finances to the ground, saying, I'm back. Look at what I've done. Walking out from behind a curtain with boxing gloves on. I'm a fighter. Most guys would have, I think he said, crawled under the blanket and gone to sleep. So yes, it's like all of that wrapped into one event.
And then he used that period in his life. We remember now the opening of The Apprentice, where he's like, I lost big league and I've come back. Like, he continued to tell that story about that comeback and used it right up to The Apprentice. That was part of the narrative that was then fed to Americans in their living room every week for years.
One of the things I didn't realize is that Fred, his father, owes his wealth or owed his success in large part to the federal government, that he came along at the right time. Tell us a little bit about that, um, especially considering Trump's newfound aversion to the government and his advocacy of free markets. How did Fred get to be rich?
Well, it's interesting. So Fred started out, he was fairly young. He was in his teens, and the family had had a small inheritance. His father died of the Spanish flu, and in his teens, he started out with his mother's help and some family help, building first of all just single family homes with garages on them, and that sort of seemed like the track that he was going on, and he was incredibly successful doing it. But then he switched gears. Both, two federal housing programs came along, one on the back of the Depression and the other on the back of the war. And it was able to get loans through those programs and went into very large projects, switched from what he was doing and went into those projects and was able to get government backed loans, and he was able to keep his costs down in doing it and get loans for a larger amount and pocket the difference. It became a sort of I guess, a bit of a profit machine for him. He was exploiting loopholes at the time, but he got into those programs, and he just very fortuitously that he was, in a spot at that time and had the contacts that he could do that.
And we knew from litigation that was filed, although it was eventually settled, that there were allegations of housing discrimination. How much were you able to find, and how prevalent was this practice, and how much do you think Trump actually knew about it?
I think I can't imagine that it was anything other than an open secret within the organization itself. There was testimony in that case from rental agents that they were told to code applicants based on whether they were, the term of the time, colored or not. There was a long-standing habit that sustained itself well past that litigation of funneling African American tenants to one project that was in central Brooklyn. It was called Patio Gardens, not Fred's premier project. He didn't maintain that building as well as he did his other buildings. And so all of that was like a collective of decisions that were really central to the organization itself. I've talked to people who were early renters in Trump Village, his very last project. And they said when that first opened, it was an affordable project with certain income thresholds, that there was a typical like crosscut of Brooklyn there. There were African American applicants, and there were Jewish applicants, and there were Italian applicants. But then when everybody moved in, it was just all Jewish applicants. And if you talk to people who lived there during those years, the entire building smelled of Jewish cooking, but no, there was no soul food going on in that building, right? And so, that was, I think, a very much an open secret, and it came out in the litigation. And Donald took the helm of that and really stretch it out for an extra year in a pointless fight that gave them, in the end, a worse deal than they were offered before the government even filed the case.
Before we get to Apprentice, I do want to ask about his reputation for stiffing employees, stiffing contractors. How prevalent was this, and how did he continue to find people to work for him if he didn't pay people, or he wrestled them to the mat so that they would they got paid 10 cents on the dollar or 20 cents on the dollar?
Right. It's a great question, but I have to say that practice is sort of background music for the entire book. I mean, there's even a wonderful story about Fred that we have early on, where there was a kid that was out in the neighborhood one day with his dad, and they were walking around, and they see Fred Trump on a Sunday afternoon with the couch out on the sidewalk, and he's arguing with the guy, and this young kid who knew Donald and his dad come up, and they're like, "What's going on, Fred?" And Fred was very angry at this guy and said, he agreed to have this couch that was sitting out on the sidewalk hauled away for $5, but the couch was bigger. The guy wanted more money, and Fred was arguing with him for a couple dollars. Ended up, he took it away for $5, and the guy was like, "Fred, what are you doing?" And he goes, "It's not the $5, it's the win." So this came to Donald early, but we talked to so many people through the book who just got stiffed by him. And Part of it, you don't know how many people actually knew. Some of it went to litigation, but a lot of it, Donald Trump was calculating that they would never sue, and that they because the cost of suing would be so much, so they would accept 20, 30 cents on the dollars and sometimes walk away. But some of these people were, they knew that people who needed to get paid knew to hold out on signing the certificate of occupancy in some cases on buildings, like never to sign it until you're paid, because he just had this horrible reputation. And consultants knew to keep going until there was a certain point, and then they would stop and wait to get paid on projects. Some of the people I talked to said that they just knew you never got in over your skis. There was another project in Chicago where he refused to. The lawyers just finally said, if you're not going to pay us, we'll send all the closing documents back to your office. And they did, because he refused to pay. I mean, this is just decade after decade after decade that was built in.
Well, at least the lawyers eventually wised up, and apparently they now insist upon getting paid up front in his litigation, because he was also infamous for not paying lawyers.
And his lawyers now are getting paid by political donors and not
Correct,
necessarily
correct.
the Trump organization. Yeah.
Correct. All right. So fast forward, Mark Burnett comes along. Why did he choose Donald Trump? As you point out, there were lots of other executives who actually were successful, and some of them who were pretty good on TV, frankly. Why Donald Trump?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, look, I'm not sure that Mark Burnett agreed that some of them were good on TV. Part of the calculus was that people like Warren Buffett and Jack Welch were really busy and would not open their lives to probing cameras and schedule a scene every week to oversee some basically like childish skits, right? Where you're trying to sell lemonade on the streets of Manhattan, and I'm going to pick who was the best at selling lemonade. And also, but a big factor of it that we heard a lot of was that they just weren't very charismatic. They're not going to carry the room in the same way. And there was a moment when that really came to fruition very early in the show, when in the very first episode, there's this guy that all the producers thought was a genius. He was a medical doctor. He was doing venture capital or something. And they thought he was the guy who was going to win. And Trump fired him in that very first episode. And the people in the production booth thought, well, this is crazy. This makes no sense. And we're going to have to re-engineer the whole week of tape to make it look like this guy messed up when he hadn't. But they also realized at the same time, this is great, because it may not be real life magic, but it's television magic, right? It's shocking. It's dramatic. It's surprising in some way. And so all of the things that really haunted him in business, being unpredictable, following his instincts, not being at all analytical, really served him very well in that weird environment. And then the producers would just make him look good after the fact. So that was that charisma and that unpredictability became a real virtue in television.
And it's interesting. We have a scene out in Burbank, when they're out at NBC, and Mark Burnett's pitching the show. Donald Trump is not there, but somebody who is there who knows Donald Trump is Jeff Zucker. And Jeff Zucker knew Donald Trump's reputation. Jeff Zucker went on to be the head of CNN. He was a senior executive at NBC. He was desperate to get this show because NBC really wanted to get in on the reality TV space. They really wanted to be in business with Mark Burnett. It didn't have to do anything with Donald Trump. Mark Burnett was red hot. He's coming off a Survivor. And there's this meeting where they did a deal. It's called doing a deal in the room out in Hollywood, where you seal it then. And there was a discussion that we had that we replay in the book, where they knew Donald Trump was this PR whore and everything else. But there was a comment made in this discussion that they knew that Donald Trump would draw eyeballs. They hired him because of that, not because of his business acumen.
When they walked into the office, you paint an interesting scene. It was not this bustling hive of activity. It wasn't shiny and beautiful. It was kind of this dingy, kind of dead place. which kind of seems to be a little bit of a metaphor for the condition that the company was in. When they got into the offices, did they realize that they had to, in essence, do a makeover for Donald Trump? Because this was not an impressive operation.
They did. That was one of the more stark scenes in the book. When we talked to these producers individually, they told us these stories about coming in, and they just come out of the jungle. These are really, Mark Burnett by this point had some pretty top rate producers coming in and cameramen, and they were, I would say it's understatement to say they were shocked about what they saw. They thought they were coming into this mogul's office. And I think they genuinely had an impression that he was, kind of like a Fortune 500 guy. And they come in and they say that the carpet needed refreshing like nothing else. It stunk. And that the furniture was chipped. And the offices themselves were small. They weren't impressive at all. And they just were like, wow, they knew they had to do a whole makeover, and they realized they couldn't even film in his offices. So separate offices were created to give it a grand feeling like you would imagine. They say that Donald Trump was the prize. When you think about it, it's a TV show and they're competing to go work for this guy who's allegedly some mogul. So they had to make him look impressive. And so they started on this huge makeover of Donald Trump to make him look wealthier than he was and more impressive than he was, so that these kids coming in, some of them are, Harvard MBAs, that they would actually want at the end of it to go work for this guy.
We've heard lots of stories about his racist remarks and how much editing they had to do to kind of fix things behind him. How was he to work with? After all, he stayed with the show for years until he ran for president. Was he cooperative? Was he obstreperous? Was he difficult? What was it like for these people who, after all, work in reality TV, which is not, powder puff football, to work with someone like Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was all those things at different times. There were things they loved about him and things that really worried him. They had this special code. They told us, they would start almost every day when he arrived on a set, broadcasting over the walkie-talkies whether he was in a good mood or a bad mood. And if he was a bad mood, you wanted to stay out of his way and it was going to be a tough day. He was kind of preening. He had this special camera and so he could look at himself while a special monitor while standing up without having to sit down and wrinkle his suit. And it was at a certain height just for where his head reached. But then when and also, if they needed him to say something positive about a company, he didn't care what the company was or what they sold. He was all in for it because that was where his money was coming from. They felt they had other people they would dealt with who would be cautious about whether they were going to endorse certain toothpastes but if they needed him to say one razor company was great one day and then the next day say that another razor company was the best in the world, he was fine doing that. So he was ideal for that. If there were interviews to do with the media, he would make himself available all day long, any day, any time of day. But then when they had to deal with sponsors who in some cases were paying $3 and $4 and $5 million an episode, and he was getting half of that money, they would have a hard time with him. He would not be respectful of them. There's a great scene in the book where QVC is hosting him to come in after they've sponsored an episode just to give him a chance to sell his latest book on their very powerful marketing network. And they build a special landing pad for him because he doesn't want to land his helicopter 200 yards away at the actual airport next to the studio. He doesn't want to take the 5-minute car ride. So they build a special landing spot for him on the grass. It starts to come in and all of a sudden it lifts back up and goes over to near the employee parking lot and sprays gravel over all these employee cars. They all file insurance claims. The head of QVC is, cursing like, what is going on here? And they ask the bodyguard when they get out of the thing, what was that about? And they said, well, Donald didn't want to get his loafers muddy, so he wanted to land on pavement. So we went over and landed on that. So there are all these things that happened where he really was not respectful of the sponsors who were making him wealthy just for being the host of this show. So again, it's a complicated answer because it's a complicated guy and it was all situational to him.
Right. We found there was another incident where, and this was a company called Genworth. They had paid, I think, $4 million to be on the show. And they wanted to, a lot of this was esprit de corps for these shows when they would come in and they wanted to let their employees know that they're going to be on. And they wanted Donald Trump just to do, it would take 5 minutes, just do a blast message that they would send out to all the employees on their voicemail saying, I'm fired up about tonight's show. And Donald Trump was asked to do it. He's being paid $4 million for this episode, and he asked to be paid additional money to do this voicemail. And one of the staffers of The Apprentice, one of the producers said, "You are being paid." He ended up doing it, but he actually asked for more money.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he decides to run for president. Did he really think he was going to be able to keep the show and run for president? Did this come as a sad surprise to him that he was going to have to give up a television show if he wanted to run for president of the United States? Take us through that period of time a little bit.
I mean, it's a really big turning point in his life. As the show's ratings dwindled over the years, the money he had gotten from licensing had fallen from a high of like $30 or $40 million a year down to just a couple $1 million a year. And a lot of people thought, he was doing that just to sort of reinvigorate his brand and his name and get some more of that sort of easy money. Again, the ratings from the show had dropped. But he kind of got warned. I mean, NBC executives told him, and there's very vivid scenes. I don't want to give away a whole lot at the end of the book, but there's very vivid scenes where they're warning him, if you do this, like, we don't know if we can go along with this, right? This is not going to work. And then after he makes that announcement in Trump Tower in June of 2015, where he says horrible things about Mexican immigrants, they called him and said, we just can't be in business with somebody who's going to do that. He called them like nasty names, as he does. And it all fell apart at the very end there. It's not clear whether he thought he could do both at the same time, run for president, be president, but it ended. I think, to me, what's important about that moment is that he came from behind this veil that Mark Burnett had created for him. They made him into this very effectual, thoughtful, considerate guy, and they edited out everything else. Well, this is the first time he really steps from behind that veil in a big way. And right away, it ends the biggest gravy train of his life, all these licensing deals and this television show. And it's never really come back on anything like that scale again.
So how wealthy was he at the end of Apprentice? Have you figured out his worth at that point?
We have a lot of visibility into what he was making each year, but net worth is really tricky, and we haven't. I mean, we do see, and Russ mentioned that, and I think it's important to just emphasize how much his licensing deals were falling off. He's now chasing licensing deals on the other end. It's sort of what he knows. He hasn't actually built anything since the Chicago Tower in 2008, 9. But it's really hard to know his net worth coming out. But I think it's reasonable when you think about it, that one of the reasons he wanted to run was to sort of jumpstart his brand, because he was at the end of Celebrity Apprentice, which was sort of cringe-inducing to watch it. It was a far away from where we started at The Apprentice in that first year, and people weren't paying as much to be on the show. It had really tailed off along with those licensing deals.
But we can tell, Jen, that the trend lines were not good. He had as we said, he created a round of businesses, the Chicago Tower that Sue mentioned. He had renovated the old post office. He had bought some golf courses in the UK. They were all failing. He had secretly declared the Chicago Tower worthless to him on his income taxes. The old post office, he was having to put $7 to $10 million a year to keep it open. He was using, it looks like to us, his entertainment money to support the businesses that made him look like a business person. And then he had to, in the course of that time, sell all of his stock. He had unloaded more than $100 million in stock, so he had no real investments left by the time he's running. It looks like he has some money-losing businesses, a few that are doing okay, one that he doesn't run at all, that is the best thing that ever happened to him and continues to do well and is the source of wealth to him, 2 buildings that are run by a company called Vornado. But the point is, I think all the trend lines were going really the wrong direction, and the things that he'd been using to keep himself afloat had all disappeared.
Yeah, Russ makes a good point, and I think it's worth noting that we were seeing on his tax returns capital injections going into a lot of the businesses. He's got these overseas golf courses. He had the old post office. There was money going out to plug holes. Like, not only were they not doing well, but these properties, they take a lot of money to upkeep. And we were seeing, when we got the tax returns, a lot of money going out just to keep things afloat at those places. So he wasn't doing well. Yeah.
And do you have a grasp of where some of those dollars came from? Was he getting banks simply to roll over loans? Was he seeking foreign money? How did he keep plugging these holes that sort of kept springing up as he had to return to his original business, which he wasn't very good at?
He had some loans from banks on some of the bigger projects from the old post office, but he was using them largely, and maybe Russ has got a bit of a different take on it, but he was using the money that he was making from The Apprentice. I think largely that was his wellspring right then, and he had made a lot of money, and that money that he was making was going in to support these other businesses.
While he was president, and this kind of takes us beyond the scope of the book, he seemed to use the presidency to drive business at his locations. We know from the congressional investigators, a lot of these were farm businesses. We just recently learned that he was charging the Secret Service triple the rates that ordinary people stayed in his hotel. Does that surprise you that he felt compelled to keep juicing these businesses, even though he's president of the United States, and potentially after being president, people become exorbitantly wealthy? What was this kind of money grubbing, scraping every dime from the couches all about, do you think?
I think it's about being Donald Trump. I think that's a lesson of our entire examination, is that he will take advantage of every opportunity, whether it's bending the rules, as he's done with tax law throughout his life, at many times breaking those rules from what we've been able to untangle. I can't imagine him being who he is, the person that emerges in this book, and not doing what he did when he was in the White House. And I think it's compounded by the fact that of the trend lines that we talked about that were hidden from public view at the time, but he had lost huge revenue streams, and he had businesses that required influxes, and he's accustomed to a certain lifestyle, right? And so all of this, being able to funnel money to his different businesses to help keep them afloat, maybe even put a little money in his pocket, is not surprising. One of the things we saw as soon as he announced, he increased the initiation fee at Mar-a-Lago. There was a huge interest in people wanting to join there, to be close to him, some to curry favor with him. Look, you could now bribe a president of the United States with what appeared to be a legitimate business transaction. So people were paying this initiation fee. He started seeing $5 and $6 million extra in revenue coming into Mar-a-Lago. He hadn't been able to take money out of that as profit for years, but then he started taking that exact amount out each year in distributions to himself, just right out the back door. So again, it's just a very easy way to funnel money to him. And we don't have a notion of the extent of that. We don't know who a lot of those people were, what their motivations were. And I'm not sure that anybody has really taken a serious look at that or considered what would happen this time, when it's going to be more out in the open, and he's going to be a lame duck president from day one if he wins.
Some of his transactions are pretty penny ante, to put it mildly. I don't know how many pairs of sneakers the guy can sell, but it can't be that many. And all of these, the trading cards and all this other stuff. Does he do this stuff to make money, or does he do it because he needs to feed his ego to think that people want his brand, want his image?
I think there may be a little bit of both in there, but the deals we've seen recently, let's see, the Bibles, the sneakers, I mean, it's crazy, but he's getting licensing fees from those. We don't know exactly the terms of those, but he doesn't have to sell. He can sell no sneakers, and he's still going to clock that. Same, with He's going into crypto. We don't know the terms of all of that, but he doesn't have a stake in it. He's getting a licensing fee from it. I think when you step back and you think about these recent deals, I think what's interesting about them is just how different they are from the ones that he was involved. Before, he was really considered a luxury brand. We can debate that, but I think you talk to retail experts and they sort of look at it that way. They've stopped following him. He's really gone into this area of grievance and martyrism, and he's now a political brand, and that's sort of how he's hoping to make his money. And he's got True Social. The stock's gone back up. I think the sentiment in the country's changing. It's probably following that in recent days. But I think that's where we're now seeing his brand going, and he's doing licensing deals overseas. I don't know if that continues. If he doesn't win, it would be hard to believe why it would. But if he does win, I think what's going to be interesting to see is how he continues to try and monetize his name. Before, I think when he ran the first time, there was a lot of hubbub and promises made that they wouldn't do that sort of thing. I think they feel a lot more just unencumbered now. And will he really try and monetize the presidency this time in a way we saw it before, but not, I don't think, to the extent that maybe it could happen this time.
Taking a step back, although you guys have been immersed in this stuff for years, are you still somewhat taken aback by how thoroughly he has frankly deceived the public into creating an image that is so unlike, if there is such a thing, as the real Donald Trump? How completely television was able to remake him and then sustain him, even through the presidency, when he was behaving more weirdly, more erratically, that this image still clung to him? Does that surprise you at some level?
It still is breathtaking. I mean, I think that one of the things that we started to see in this book was we had to turn the lens also on sort of American society and American media as well, and how it is that we make people famous, and how difficult it is if someone's wealthy to challenge the notion that they're good at what they say they're good at. He's got a jet. He must be, and he says he made it all on business. He must have made it all on business. How do you challenge that? I really think, one of the tenets of the Republican, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. One of the tenets of the Republican war against wokeism is that people want to create a safe space everywhere they go in the world. Well, Donald Trump's life has been a series of safe spaces that were created for him mostly by other people. And it allowed him to hide from the reckoning of really a chain of bad decisions throughout his life. First from his father. That gave him the standing to look wealthy, to become famous. People started calling him a billionaire before he had any money separate from his father at all. It was really crazy. And that lasted for a decade while he is building this jalopy of an empire completely on borrowed money with no ability to run any of the businesses that he's buying. And shockingly, it all collapses within 5 years. But then the magic just starts all over again, right? This whole fame machine. And then again, television really, you can't, it's difficult, I think, to grasp the degree to which remaking his image in the public mind both made him marketable, made him wealthy, and also opened the door to him to seem credible to a wide array of voters. And then now look at how lucky he's been with this. There has not been another time in our lives when you could say the things he said yesterday, let alone the things he said about John McCain 8 years ago, and then live for another day in politics. That had never happened before. Yeah. But he's walked into this media ecosystem that excuses all of that makes it go away, that says that anybody who challenges it is just out to get him and out to get you and hates conservatives somehow. You saw it in Bret Baier's interview with Kamala Harris, right? Where he pretends that Donald Trump has not been saying there are people who are his political opponents, that Nancy Pelosi is an enemy within and that she needs to be dealt with by some kind of military tribunal. He can tell his viewers that that's not true because they don't know it. They haven't seen it, right? So it flies right there. And that's sort of the last safe space. or the most recent safe space of his life that has somehow, he's a really unique figure in our history, I think, in that he has benefited from so many societal changes that have allowed him throughout his life to seem much more credible, much more filled with extraordinary ability than he ever actually was.
And Jen, I got to tell you, I start to think, I don't think Americans really think he's this billionaire anymore. Russ and I have been so in this, and it just can't be true. They're going to vote for him for some other reason. It's immigration, it's inflation. And then this morning, I'm listening to the New York Times podcast, and it was one actually from a couple days ago. But they're interviewing some voters, and they're explaining why they're voting for Donald Trump. And a couple of them said, well, because he's this great businessman and he can fix it. And I'm just like, I got to get him a copy of our book. Like, I was just like, are you kidding me? And it still persists. And I think it comes down to, you cannot underestimate just the power of television and the power of repetition, that people, in the face of everything that has been written, they're just going to want to believe what they're going to believe. They've watched the show, and maybe they're not paying attention to everything every day, but they are still clinging to that idea. And it's just ridiculous.
And because our media has become so siloed, he can just play hopscotch and avoid all of these interviews or situations in which he might be revealed. And you have him, even as he's being accused of being exhausted or becoming physically or mentally deteriorated, canceling interviews, not going on CNBC, not going on NBC. So he continues to manipulate the system very much to his advantage. I want to end with a related but obviously very relevant question. Was he more balanced, more sane, more disciplined years ago? Has he deteriorated from what you've seen? And then you've probably watched more film of him than any two human beings alive and talked to more people who have dealt with him. God bless you. What has happened to him? Has he deteriorated in some noticeable fashion, in your view?
Well, I'm sure we both have a lot of thoughts on that. It's been in our head for a long time. But I think he's always been the person that you see in certain important respects. He's always believed that his life is unfairly difficult. He's always believed that he's being persecuted because of who he is. We start hearing him say that when he's in his 20s, and he hasn't really even faced an obstacle, but he believes people are out to get him just because he's Donald Trump. He really stops having respect for anybody who has sort of subject area expertise and believes his instincts are the best. He stops worrying about any kind of, I used the term earlier, reckoning coming, because when it comes, he'll just lie about it. All that's happening when he's in his late 20s and early 30s. There's a real turning point in 1985 when he's had first flush success, 3 projects that he did with more experienced partners that went well. And if he would have kept doing that with more experienced partners, he probably would have kept doing well. But he suddenly decides he doesn't need any of that. And people around him notice there's a change, that he doesn't want to hear their thoughts and views and analysis either. And that just becomes more and more calcified over the course of his life, that he'll just invent his own reality to make anything that looks not good go away. So I think it's like a natural extension of where he's the trajectory of his entire life. And that was part of the intrigue for us of looking at his life in this way. And then I think also it's compounded by pressure and age, both. You do see he does seem like he is just even more likely to say things that are not only dishonest, but if you really step back, make him sound kind of not very smart either, right? They just don't make sense.
Right. I look back at film of him, not even in his 20s, but in his 30s, 40s. He was speaking in complete sentences. He had a cogent thought, even if it was a silly one or didn't match reality. Now he sounds much more disjointed, much more scattered. Sue, do you think that is time and age? What do you attribute that to? He is clearly not as, on the ball as he once was, aside from all of his personality defects and moral issues.
Right. I think Peter Baker at the New York Times did a great piece on this the other day. And I think a lot of it does come down to age. I think some of it's pressure, but the things you see with age are people are just much more frank. Like they'll say what they're thinking. There's just no censor. And I think you're seeing part of that. And that's actually a condition of age. I think that's one of the things that we're seeing. And then Russ mentioned the pressure. I don't think we can underestimate the pressure that he is under. Both, he went through all these lawsuits and now just facing the election and all the pressures that are on him. Just the things coming at him have to take a toll on him. And I think we're seeing that displayed, in various like, I still can't believe that 35 or 40 minutes of just dancing on stage. Like, what happened there?
Right.
But this is, I think we're seeing this, all these issues that we're talking about coming to play at a moment like that.
Last question for you, and I guess this is a little bit difficult, but do you think the coverage of him, this election, last election, has been effective enough to bring this out? Do you think the media has kind of stopped trying because it's so impossible to break through? How would you kind of grade the day-to-day media, not the books, not the research, not the long-form pieces, in terms of trying to explain to the American people who he is? Or is that just a fool's errand at this point?
It's never a fool's errand. I mean, I don't think there's anything that's more important that's going on today in today's media. But I think we're collectively a lot better at it than we were 8 years ago. He was a new kind of figure. We never had anybody we never called anybody a liar until Donald Trump at the New York Times, right? That was a seismic shift, just trying to deal with this onslaught of daily untruths. So I think, but it just every day is an overwhelming challenge. How do you deal with talking about Arnold Palmer's in a shower and dancing on a stage and enemies within, and we have to ship out everybody who's like come here as an immigrant over the last 20 years, all into like one day. It's just an onslaught of gibberish, but then really important stuff as well. And you have to try to deal with all of it. I think you can't exclude some of it, but it does create this overwhelming sense of just like, well, it's just another day in Trump land, and whether any of it matters, I don't know, but I don't think we have a choice to not do it. And I can't see a super clear way to do it a lot better.
Yeah, I think you can't normalize it. And you also have to just have in the back of your mind how much of this is him just trying to change the discussion and to put something out there that's going to just distract people. And I think as a journalist, you just have to be aware of all of those issues. But Russ and I, we do more investigative work. We have a lot of benefit of hindsight. I really feel for the people on the front lines. We get it right. Do they get it right every day? No. But there's just a lot of pressures, and I think they're really trying. But it's tough for all the reasons that Russ just laid out. It's a hard one.
Well, thank you for writing the book. If for no other reason than I think to remind people that this is what journalism is. This is what digging for the facts are. This is the hard work of interviewing people and going back to people. And I think because we've gotten used to a different kind of splashy, opinion-driven news that people forget. So congratulations on the book. I think it is an astounding achievement, and you are very generous in crediting a lot of people, including Mary Trump, who contributed. But kudos on this work, and I hope you are on to something less stressful and perhaps more invigorating than Donald Trump in the near future.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Great.
And that was Russ and Susanne. We can laugh at certain episodes because they are inherently ridiculous and funny. But as Russ said, there's an underlying tragedy about this that goes beyond Donald Trump. It goes to what has become of American culture, what's become of the American psyche. How did it come to be that we glorify crass unhinged, excessive wealth, and all of the attributes that he demonstrates: cruelty, crassness, vulgarity. How is it that we have come so far and have now not even exempted the presidency of the United States from that crass culture that is so endemic in our society? We can blame or attribute Donald Trump to Mark Burnett and The Apprentice. We can say the people who have enabled him all of his life are responsible. And of course, Donald Trump is responsible for Donald Trump. He had every advantage in the world. He had wealth, he had opportunity, and he turned it to self promotion, to grotesque purposes, and has abused his fame and fortune and power ever since. But I think it also requires that we collectively look in the mirror. How did we come to think that this is admirable? Why do we attribute success, leadership, intelligence to someone who behaves this way? It is somewhat mind blowing. And when you see the contrast between people like Kamala Harris and Liz Cheney, who were out doing events on Monday of this week, talking about honor, patriotism, decency, it's like they're in another universe. That universe is foreign to Donald Trump. He thinks, to quote a phrase, those people are suckers and losers because they care about such things, because they think of something greater than themselves. That is inconceivable to Donald Trump, who is the neediest, the most greedy, the most hollow man one can imagine. And I've talked and written about, the mainstream media is beginning to talk and write about his narcissism, his real emotional and mental deficiencies. But the rest of us are supposedly sane. America doesn't have a excuse of 50, 60, 70 million people suffering from a psychological defect. They have simply lowered their standards and accepted Donald Trump as someone who is an appropriate figure to represent the United States. And that is sad. That is tragic. I hope that that is not a majority of the country or the electorate. And that when people get into that voting booth, they say, is that really what I want? Is that really the kind of person I want in the White House? And Liz Cheney made a joke that if you don't want him babysitting your kids, don't elect him president. But that is more true than we would like to believe, that people who would never in a million years trust their kids, trust their own finances, seek advice from him, are willing to give him the job of president. And that's in part because they, and unfortunately the media, have come to treat politics as a game. We've become so cynical that we no longer consider it important. We no longer consider it valuable. So we are willing to delegate it to a TV star who operates in the world of make-believe. But the good news is we still have 2 weeks, guys. You can still register in many places. There's same-day registration in some states. You can go out and vote. And you can implore your friends and relations and colleagues and neighbors to think hard about whether they really want someone like Donald Trump running the country. Aren't we better than he is? Aren't we better than that? And if the answer is we're not, then God help us and God help democracy, because it's not sustainable without some level of what we used to call public virtue. So, don't give up hope yet. Don't be demoralized. Get out and vote. Run through the tape. 2 weeks to go. Thanks so much for joining us. If you like this program, please tell your friends. They can listen and follow us wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.